So I want to conclude the preflop section with a subject that's important to understand for preflop, but also is going to lead nicely as we start to talk about postflop concepts. And the idea is that small adjustments, when amplified across many streets, can end up making a very large difference in the way your strategy plays against your opponent and how much equity your opponent will need to have in order to bluff you. So I want to pull this up here really quick. And I want to talk about this. Let's say that we're opening our standard range of 90% of hands. And versus 3-bet, we're going to play 32% hands as flats. And we're going to have, we're going to have 7% as 4-bets. So we take our continue range, 0.39. Let's say we're opening 90%, which is our standard open. And let's just say that, divided by 0.39 divided by 0.9. So we're going to end up only defending about 43% of our hands. Now, if we put in fold to 3-bet here into our equation, assuming a standard size, then we're going to fold 57. Our 4-bet will end up being something like around 8%. You can see that your opponent only needs 23% equity. So you might say, Doug, if you start off with this range, then you're going to end up folding way too much. But here's the beauty of just a few small changes. Now, let's say rather than opening 90%, let's say we're opening 85%. And now, rather than defending 39% of all hands, let's say we're defending 41% or 42% of all hands. So all we did was decrease open range by 5%, which is pretty small, and then increase defend versus 3-bet by 2 or 3%. Let's just say 3%, which is again pretty small, and the effect can be drastic. Now we have 42% of all hands defending divided by half the hands. So we're going to be defending about we're going to be folding about 50.5%. Additionally, if you increase your 4-bet slightly, now you're up to 30%. But you might say, Doug, that's still, they're going to have a profitable bluff with some of their weakest hands. And by just adding in, a few percent more folds, which is why when I originally said if you open 80, you're almost never going to have problems. Well, now if we make it 80%, and let's just say we don't even increase the range of hands we play, 0.42 divided by 0.8. Now all of a sudden we're going to be continuing with 52.5% of hands. So it's more like this. And now all of a sudden the 32% threshold is a lot higher, especially out of position. This in conjunction with like a higher 4-bet frequency will start to immediately have a large effect on your opponent's ability to 3-bet you. Now, that's just with folding 10% more hands and 4-betting 1% more of your range. And this will actually increase more now, even if you have the same range, because let's just say you 4-bet 7%. Well, if you're opening 70% of hands or 80% of hands, it ends up being a number more like 8 or 9% or 10% than when you're opening 90 and have the same range. So this could even become 10. And rapidly what starts to happen is you end up deterring the opportunity to bluff here by making small adjustments. And that's why I'm a very big fan when someone says to me oftentimes in spots where they say, Doug, this guy's bluffing the river a lot. What should I do? And I often say, well, you know what? Let's start with the whole hand here. Like, how are you getting out to the river? How often are you getting to the river? What are the core concepts of their strategy? When someone bases their strategy around 3-betting, you want to make sure the equity they need to 3-bet you is high. When someone bases their strategy around opening really loose, you want to make sure the equity they need to open is really high. When someone's strategy revolves around playing pretty tight with low equity to do things, you're much more okay letting them have those profitable opportunities. And that's why when we look at our strategies, we look at the opening, the 3-betting, the 4-betting, but really the opening and the 3-betting, and I guess the 5-betting as well to some extent, generally speaking, we try to be a little bit on the loose side, knowing we're going to allow our opponent a pretty low barrier to bluff us, because we know that historically against the sample size of the player pool, that those options will make money. But when you start to face opposition that's fighting you for those pots, attacking you tooth and nail, don't start making radical shifts. And going back to the river example, let's say you're going to fold more rivers, or you're going to call more rivers. How about playing a few percent tighter pre? How about, if necessary, how about 3-betting slightly less or slightly more, or whatever makes sense given what you're trying to accomplish? How about check folding the flop a few percent more? How about check folding the turn a few percent more? How about adding 1 or 2% more traps in your range? I mean, when you think about the way all of these things add up, you could have your river fold go from 45 or 50% to 40%. by only making 1 or 2% of a change on your range on each street. It compounds like that. And then by the time you're on the river, you end up not even needing to really do that much. You know, maybe you call with about the same range you would normally call with, maybe a little bit wider. But the thing is, you made adjustments on earlier streets that allowed you to beat them. Pre-flop is very simple. By making sure you have enough equity to see flops, understanding that you have a degree of equity loss out of position, and finally, basing your counter strategy to your opponent around what they're trying to accomplish, you can make sure that you have a good strategy. And you know, maybe there could be an argument that as equity required increases, you have to decrease the degree of polarization in your range, and that makes some sense. You know, as people fold to 3-bets less, as they have in the last few years, bluff 3-betting has become a lot worse, and I'm aware of that. There's a lot of opponents where I'm very careful with picking offsuit bluffs because, you know, they don't really play very tight versus 3-bet, or they play quite loose versus 3-bet. And also nowadays, people tend to open tighter to begin with, and they're more aware of all this type of thing. So yes, if you 3-bet somebody who's opening 75 and plays on the loose side against 3-bet, you will not have enough equity with your bluff hands to do okay. So versus that player, of course, it makes sense to 3-bet a more merged value range. But you need to be aware of, as equity required increases, the degree of being able to bluff decreases, the ability to re-raise more frequently decreases, and a lot of small changes result in a big change for your opponent's strategy. So I want to end preflop on that note. I do know that a lot of preflop here, I'm like, okay, these are the ranges, learn what you're doing. You know, I'm not going to hold your hand and be like, okay, guys, now you're facing an 8 blind 3-bet. Now you're facing an 8.5 blind 3-bet. Now you're facing a 9.5 blind 3-bet. I often get asked, how should I study? I want to get better. How do I study? And you've taken the time to buy this product because you're going to get good top-of-the-line information on how to play heads up. But if you can't repeat that information while you're playing, what good is it? Spend some time. Understand the difference between those ranges. Understand how you're going to randomize when you're playing live poker. Understand the difference between a 7, an 8, a 9 big blind 3-bet. What hands do you 4-bet? You should know how to make these changes. And it comes down to how bad do you want it. Because everything here, the pre-flop chapter of this, the pre-flop section of this product is everything you would need to know and now understand to become solid at heads of no limit pre-flop. You will not have issues pre-flop if you use approximately these ranges, make adjustments based on size, and make some small adjustments based on opponent. You will always put yourself in a position to win in heads of no limit. Post-flop's going to get tougher, but there's really no reason you should not be able to take these ranges and really perfect it. And these took me a long time. It was a lot of years of studying, looking at samples, understanding equity, and there is some degree, and we brought this up in several of the videos in this section, but there is some degree of how do I think post-flop is going for me? What are my opportunities like? Do I have a lot of opportunities to bet with really low equity? If so, maybe 3-bet some more bluffs. You know, how much are they 4-betting? If I need 40% equity and they're mainly calling, I'm going to get a lot of chances in order to try and realize that equity if they have leaks post-flop. If they're playing tough or they're trapping you or whatever, that starts to change. So keep that in mind, and let's go ahead and move into the post-flop section.